Hello, I'm author Kimberly Pauley, and I'm here today to talk to you about The Accidental Wizard, which is my very first book for younger readers, and it's also my first fully illustrated book, so that makes me super excited about it. And not only is it illustrated, but it was illustrated by the amazing Jason Cockcroft, which I think that you will definitely enjoy the pictures. Just look at the cover there. So I'm so excited about this. Anyway, The Accidental Wizard is about Twig Thicket, who is a lowly wizard's apprentice until he accidentally becomes the world's greatest wizard. This sounds like it might be a good thing, but I think Twig would argue with you because it brings him nothing but trouble. So I'm going to read to you today from chapter 1, and you can judge for yourself how much trouble you think Twig is going to be in. So, chapter 1, in which a small accident becomes a big problem. There was a shattering of glass. "Duck!" shouted Ripplemans the sage. Twig looked around in confusion. Where? They were in the tallest tower of the castle, where the wizard both lived and conducted his often unintentionally hazardous magical experiments. It was certainly no place for a duck. The only place for a duck in the whole castle was surely the kitchens, which would be a very unfortunate location to find oneself in, if you were in fact a duck. "No, I meant get down," said Ripplemans. Twig didn't need any further warning. He dropped the book he'd been reading and flattened himself against the floor, just in time to avoid something very fast and vaguely sparkly that whooshed over his head, messed up his hair, and continued out the window. There was no glass to break there, at least, it having been blown out last winter during a particularly unruly experiment. "What was that?" Twig asked as he stood up and dusted himself off. Ripplemans climbed down off the sturdy wooden chair. The sparse furnishings in the tower had to be strong or they didn't survive, and gave his robes a quick check. He seemed a bit sheepish, but that might have just been the way his curly beard made him look. He said. "That was just a little boast, a bit of hyperbole, if you will. A small accidental spell I've been storing that got away from me," he added, noting Twig's expression. "A boast? You mean like showing off?" asked Twig. Sometimes he wasn't sure if his mentor was teasing him or if he was just being strange. "Yes," said Ripplemans rather testily. "One of mine, if you must know. I was young once, after all, just like you. I'd forgotten it was even up there. It's been bottled up all this time." He flicked a bit of imaginary dust off his long purple robes and looked thoughtful. "I do hope it hasn't grown." Twig nodded, not at what the sage had said, but at what he hadn't. For instance, Ripplemans hadn't said that words have power, and so you need to keep a close eye on them. If you don't watch what you say, especially if you are a wizard, things have a tendency to happen. Explosive things, in particular. And he hadn't said what type of accidental spell it had been. Had he once, in the youthful days, claimed the sky to be bluer than it was? Had he said the king was taller, or the queen was prettier, or that the kingdom of Muckwood was the best in all the land? Which it certainly wasn't. The type of spell made all the difference, after all. And exactly how long it had been trapped in that bottle anyway. Words had a habit of getting away from Ripplemans, even now that he was the official court wizard in residence. This was probably why he was stuck in the tiny remote kingdom of Muckwood to begin with. Everyone knew that the most powerful wizards in the world, like the celebrated Kudzu of the Spire, or the brave Pumice Pummelstone of Aramore, lived in large coastal kingdoms, or near the gem-rich falling mountains. Twig reflected that Ripplemans also hadn't said what they were going to do about the escaped spell, although he already knew the answer to that question. He, as the wizard's sole surviving apprentice, would have to clean up the mess. Ripplemans had already turned back to whatever it was he'd been working on before the spell had taken flight. "Off you go then, Twig," he said, waving the boy away. "Be sure to take the number 3 net in one of the large containment bottles, perhaps a green or blue. Definitely not a clear one. I'm running low on those." Twig gathered up some supplies and stopped only long enough to look out the window the accidental spell had exited by. It overlooked the gardens and stables, and he could see that an apple tree had caught fire along one edge of the gardens. A few stable boys were trying to put it out rather ineffectually by throwing hay at it. That looked like as good a place to start as any. "Do hurry," said Ripplemans. "We don't want it running into anything important." Twig headed through the door and down the long flight of steps that led out of the tower. By the time he reached the gardens, yet another apple tree had caught on fire, and the whole of everything smelled a bit like burnt apple pie. "Did you perhaps see something sparkly go shooting by here?" Twig asked one of the stable boys. "Probably right before the tree caught on fire." "Oh, aye," said the boy, who looked like he was rather enjoying the spectacle. "I was walking old Thomas in the courtyard. He likes apples, you see, and I led him over to get one, when this thing comes whizzing by us. Hit old Tom right in the head, it did, and then it bounced off into the tree and set it on fire." Old Thomas was the king's favorite warhorse, though he was so old now that he was only trotted out on fancy occasions, such as when a neighboring king came to visit. It had been a very long time since that had happened. "Is old Thomas all right?" asked Twig, with a sinking feeling. If anything had happened to the course, the king would not be pleased, and Ripplemans would surely blame it on him somehow. King Mervyn was already seldom pleased with either of them. He thought magic was a complete waste of time, and would have done away with the position of court wizard completely, if it hadn't been for all the other kingdoms being so proud of theirs. Twig wasn't all that fond of working for Ripplemans, but it was better than living off of acorns in the forest. "See for yourself," said the boy, pulling Twig out of his thoughts and pointing into the paddock. Twig stared in disbelief. Old Thomas was nearly unrecognizable. He was cantering around in circles, his head held high and his mane and tail flowing in a particularly magnificent manner. 3 stable boys were trying to catch him, with very little success. He neighed in blatant triumph and then leapt over a fence and galloped off towards the forest. "Oh," said Twig, "I guess he's okay then." "Stable master says he ain't never seen anything like it. Old Thomas is nearly 30 years old, you know. He ain't moved like that since before either one of us was born." Twig squared his shoulders. What exactly had Ripplemans let loose? "Well, did you happen to see which way the thing went?" The boy pointed towards the middle of the garden, where the statuary maze was located. Then he wandered off and half-heartedly chucked some more hay on the burning trees. Twig skirted carefully around the fire, where servants from the kitchen were now running about with buckets of water and slopping most of it on the ground, and he entered the gardens from the south gate, since it was the one furthest away from the Kelpie pond, and he didn't feel like being drowned today. He hadn't gone far when he ran into what seemed to be the next victim of Ripplemans' escaped spell. Though victim was perhaps not quite the right word, because standing on what used to be a statue of the king was the largest gnome Twig had ever seen. All that was left of the homage to King Mervyn was the stone base. The statue itself had been shattered, and chunks of marble lay scattered in the grass. The gnome was the size of a largish toddler, which put him at about 5 or 6 times the size of a normal garden variety gnome. Rather than attempting to hide when Twig came upon him, he stood even taller and actually flexed his muscles. "Ye there!" bellowed the gnome, which was very non-gnome-like indeed. "Me?" asked Twig. "Yes, ye. I am Glimfinkel Cogfuzz Click-Kettle the 14th, king of the garden gnomes. Bring me something to eat." Said Twig. "You ain't the king," piped up a small voice from behind a rosebush. "Dinkwiz Twisteel is." A normal-sized gnome poked his head out. He was small enough to completely disappear behind a large rose. "Not any more," roared Glimfinkel. His round, chubby cheeks were bright red, matching his hat. His shouting reminded Twig of when his little brother Tadpole would throw a tantrum, except that Tadpole didn't have the long white beard. "You can't just go and declare yourself king," said another tiny voice, and a petite, even for a gnome, woman emerged from behind a rock. "Oh, yes, I can, Sprinkle Fitspark. Just look at me," shouted Glimfinkel with his hands on his pudgy hips. "I am the best gnome there ever was. How can I not be king?" He turned to Twig and pointed at him. "Bring me a feast. I want a feast. With pudding. Lots of pudding. That kind with sprinkles on." As Glimfinkel shouted, more and more gnomes were sticking their little heads out of unlikely hiding places. Twig had never realized before exactly how many gnomes lived in the gardens. Now he understood why Ripplemans had often said the place was infested. They normally kept to themselves, but right now they all looked really, really annoyed. At least their annoyance was directed at Glimfinkel, who was parading like a peacock around the base of the statue. Twig got down on his knees so he could talk to the little tiny gnome woman who was staring angrily up at Glimfinkel and shaking her fist. "What happened to him?" he asked her, though he suspected that he knew the answer. Sprinkle clucked her tongue. "Glimfinkel was sunning himself up on that statue like he always does," the lazy thought, "and then there was a flash of light, and boom!" She clapped her hands together. "The statue's gone to bits, and Glimfinkel got blowed up. Blowed up? She wagged her tiny finger at Twig. That's what I said. Just look at him. He's not even proper gnome size anymore. He's bigger than a bloomin' brownie, for heaven's sake, and looks like his head's gone big as well, thinking he's the Boggin King now. Sprinkle shook her head, looking as disgusted as something that small could look. Scores of gnomes had surrounded Glimfinkel so that they could argue with him, and a few had even climbed up to the base of the statue. A number of them had even taken out their swords, which were the size of toothpicks but had quite a wicked point. It looked like there was about to be a small-scale war. Twig stood up, stepped carefully over the gathering gnomes, and picked up Glimfinkel, holding him under his arms and keeping him at arm's length. The gnome kicked like a baby and tried to pummel Twig with his fist, but couldn't quite reach. I think perhaps you need a time out, said Twig. He looked around, unsure of what to do with the oversized gnome that he had in his hand. He didn't have time to take him back to Rimpleman's for the wizard to sort him out, not when he had to track down the escaped spell before things got even worse than gnome with grand aspirations. So he simply walked over to a nearby tree and hung the kicking gnome up from a branch by his braces. I'll be back later to shrink you down to normal size, he said to Glimfinkel. No, said Glimfinkel, amid loud cheers from the other gnomes. A few of them were even pegging him with small pebbles. Yes, replied Twig, and you lot don't go killing him or anything. The cheering died down a bit then, which was a little bit worrisome. Which way did the flashy light thing go? He asked Sprinkle. Oh, it flew off into the maze, she said. You can hear it banging around in there, can't you? Now that she mentioned it, Twig could hear something. It sounded large and fizzly and very, very fast. He sighed, squared his shoulders, and entered the maze. The longer magic ran amok, the worse it got. He needed to catch that accidental spell as soon as he could. Anyway, that was chapter 1, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will go with Twig on his journey after he finds that accidental spell and things go all haywire. Thank you.